everyone. We're live. I'm joined by Louise Sharland, who is going to start us off with an introduction to herself and her books.
Yeah. So I'm Louise. I was born in Montreal, grew up there. I studied English and then I did a bit of drama. And then I met my husband in Toronto, who's in the British Navy, moved to Britain, and I've been here ever since. And I really started my writing doing short fiction, something I'm really interested in, the kind of minutiae of human life, the kind of subtext. And then I discovered that my work was sort of increasingly, there's a lot of tension in it and suspense. And that's when I sort of gravitated towards crime. And I also always wanted to study, I did an undergraduate degree in English, and then I wanted to study at a master's level. And it just happened to be when postgraduate student loans came into play. So I applied at the University of East Anglia for a crime writing MA, and I got on it. And it was great. So that's where I really started to develop my novel writing. And I have to say, I'm still developing it a lot. I'm still learning a lot about it. My book, I've actually had a short story. I think it was 2010. I won the Women in Home magazine short story competition. And my short story was in a collection with Jojo Miles, Lee Child, Ruth Rendell. It's called The Best Little Book Club in Town. And then I was writing, I did a young adult dystopia, and then started writing crime. And then in 2019, I won the Big Issue Crime Competition. And that was a 2-book deal with HarperCollins Avon Books. And that's how I got published. And my first book is called The Lake, that way. And that came out this year. It feels longer with the lockdown. I kept on thinking it was last year, but it came out in May of 2021. And it's done okay. It's got 4.5 stars on Amazon, and Caroline gave me a very lovely review, which is really nice. And I just submitted my second novel to my publisher, so I'm waiting for notes on that, and there'll be a lot of edits on that. So just cracking on with the writing. It's hard work. Takes a lot of dedication, but I always say, I always think I'm that kind of advocate for people, particularly women, achieving things in later life. So that's me.
You're right. We were talking just as we went live, weren't we? That I found it really hard to write the review. Not because of the book. The book was marvelous. I really enjoyed it. It was a very good read, and I'm not a big reader of psychological kind of novels often, so very much enjoyed it. But I couldn't think of, and I was just saying this to my husband before I came up, I couldn't think of, there are some questions I want to ask, and I daren't while we're live. I might give away a spoiler because it's so hard.
The thing that I was interested in doing, it's odd the things that inspire you. It was Steven Spielberg when he was talking about directing Raiders of the Lost Ark and how that was based on the Saturday matinees, where they always ended on a cliffhanger. And I was trying to end almost every chapter, not too obviously or clunkily, but on a cliffhanger, because I think my editor or the publishers described it as twisty. And I think I really wanted to, it's sort of inspired by fatalism. I think when I was starting to write it, my daughter was doing her GCSEs and she was doing tests of the D'Urbervilles. And they were talking about how from the start, Tess's fate is sort of sealed. She can't escape her end. And so I wanted to play with that idea and this idea that the dominoes have been tipped already. And no matter what the character does, it's leading her down the same path. No matter how many times she tries to make a different decision, she's still being almost led by that path out of her own control. So that was kind of what I was playing around with a bit.
Test of the D'Urbervilles is one of my all-time favorite novels.
Good.
Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, I think for me, with the standout for it, with the characters were the key, weren't they? Every character is so well developed. You might not like all of them. I can think of quite a few that I didn't.
Yeah.
But they're so believable.
I I think it's really important. I wanted to tell that's just funny because I thought, "Well, I'm gonna write this really twisty story," and then because this is not a spoiler, it takes place after the death of the protagonist's 15-year-old son, a few years later, and she discovers a diary and a burner phone and starts looking into it, starts thinking that maybe his death wasn't an accident. So I was really interested in those kind of relationships, and a lot of people read it and said it's really sad because of her. There's a lot of grief that underlies her mission, I think. But I wanted to touch on that. I'm not sure why, but that was just, I know why. It's based on the story, and I won't be explicit about it because it was based on real human tragedy. So I thought I'm not going to name it. But a mother who lost her son in violent circumstances, and when the people who killed him were convicted, she said, "I forgive him. I forgive them." And I just thought, I had young children at the time. I thought, how, first of all, I was amazed by this person's magnanimity and kind of nobility. But I thought, how could anyone do that? And so I wanted to write the other side of the story. And that was kind of the drive for it. So, yeah, so characters are important. Uh, I'm not sure how I do. So I teach creative writing. In fact, I'm going in to teach illustration students. I work at an art college. I'm actually a careers advisor, but I'm going in to do a creative writing session with illustrators, and I sometimes do an exercise where we develop a character through asking questions about their background, and if you were going to create a setting and the room was an artist's room, what would it look like, and things like that. So I think for me, I always think about if it was me, what would happen? Was that believable? That kind of thing.
You definitely achieved it in the
Well,
late.
thank
I
you.
believed every character.
Oh, thank you.
And the kind of richness of them is what draws you in and keeps you reading, I think.
Well, that's what real people are, aren't they? And I was quite interested as well in Plymouth, where quite often when I go into town where I live, there would be women that were dressed in long skirts and had like handkerchiefs, headscarves, and they were part of something called the Plymouth Brethren, which I didn't know much about, and I was fascinated by. That was sort of a group, kind of fundamentalist Christian practitioners, and they live in a very kind of enclosed community. So that was, and one of the things I read years ago that publishers are interested in, and readers are interested in learning something new. So a lot of people were interested in this story, this subplot about how the main character grew up in this community, which was quite restricting. And I think what I wanted to do, because she does some dubious things, I think, sometimes, and I needed to put her under pressure. So I did that by her being isolated, by her having an unhappy marriage, and by her suffering from grief. So her actions could be really understandable by the reader and viewing it with a sense of compassion because she's gone through a lot. So that's really important in my work, compassion and social justice. So those are real themes that resonate a lot in my work.
And I think the fact that she comes from that past with the Plymouth Brethren does sort of set that sort of isolatedness from the beginning, doesn't it? You've got that sense of it always feeling like that.
There really isn't anyone she can turn to, really. And maybe that influences or impacts on some of her decision making. She is the champion. She's the one, and the book was originally called Vigil because I wanted to talk about how it's her mission, her vigil, to find out what really happened to her son. And then when you get to publishing stage, because the the imprint I'm with is commercial fiction, and I thought this was interesting. It didn't bother me, but they changed the name to the light because they do a lot of research, and they said, we're looking at books on the shelves at Tesco and on Amazon, and you need a title that immediately engages 3 seconds. Someone who's going to look at that title and pick it up. So I thought, well, you know what you're doing. So I thought, yeah, I was happy to do that. but it really is about this woman's single-minded desire to find out the truth, no matter what.
We've got some hellos on the stream. Andrew and Leslie have both said.
Hi, Samantha. Hi, Leslie.
So,
Hi, Sam.
Leslie says Far from the Madding Crowd is her favourite, one of her favourites.
Oh, Bathsheba, isn't it? Is that the one I always remember? It is Bathsheba, where Gabriel, the opening scene where the sheep go over the cliff. It's just so tragic. And I like Hardy's poetry as well. So
I like his poetry.
Yeah.
I like poetry in general. I'm reading some Tolkien.
I haven't read Tolkien's poetry, actually. Interesting. In the book, there's some poetry, and I deliberately made everyone in the book not very good poets because I'm not a very good poet. So I thought I can't go wrong if I make them all lousy poets. Then it works. But I'm just reading the comment about twists in crime novels.
I think that's Andrew.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is a journey, and so the second book I've written, it's really, and you must know this, everyone is as readers, you know, I've been putting in a lot of Easter eggs. So something that I set up in chapter 2, I did deliberately, and I'm going to connect with in chapter 10. And that takes a lot of work, and you go back and forth, and you do your planning. But in the most recent book, which is called My Husband's Secrets, again about domestic, I suppose that the genre is domestic noir. You know, the safe, supposedly domestic environment is not so safe. But I rewrote it. So I wrote it for my publishers, and then I had some really excellent notes from my editor. And then I rewrote the whole thing, which nearly killed me. But I had all these plans, and then the end came together in a completely different way that I hadn't planned, which was really nice because it's nice to know you can have some spontaneity and it still works. So that was good.
So, do you know, when did you say book 2 was likely to come out?
I think it's going to be in April 2022. And that is, again, it's the same. I really like themes that to do with why good people do bad things. What makes you or me, someone who's got the best intentions, kind of make those bad decisions? And what's the wider impact? So this book is really focusing on that. It's similar, but not. It's not along the same line. I'm still family set up. And then I'm also working on another book for my agent, which I did as part of my MA, which is a probation officer who gets drawn into a series of murders in Plymouth. So I'm really using the Plymouth landscape. Plymouth is a really interesting city. It's beautiful, but it also has, in terms of what happened in the war, it was pretty much destroyed in the war, rebuilt. There's a lot of social deprivation in Plymouth, but the people are the nicest in the country, I think. So that one I'm working on it now. It's called Vengeance Street. So that's going to come out as soon as my agent sells it to a publisher. But I've got to rewrite it first. So I'm keeping busy. I think that's important.
It's exciting to hear that there's going to be another book.
Yeah, and I've got 2 more after that, 3 more after that, and as long as I live that long, hopefully I'll get them done. But I think for readers, it's really funny actually. I went to a Pilates class last night, and they had these big windows. It's quite cold, and the instructor couldn't shut the windows, and she asked the caretaker to come and close them. And he had one of those really long sticks with a hook on the end to close it. And I looked at it, and all I could think of was murder weapon. Once you write crime and read crime, that's what you see everywhere. So I really like exploring how people interact. Again, what makes someone take that wrong path? A good person.
You said you wrote some YA dystopian.
I did.
Did you publish that?
No, it was around the time that Hunger Games was coming out. I think YA is harder to get to break into than crime fiction. It's really, really competitive. It's really saturated market. But it was really kind of a exploration of it was inspired by a book called My Secret Camera, which is it was a series of pictures. A chap in the Lotz ghetto during the Nazi occupation hid a camera in his coat and took pictures. And it moved me so much. I'm going to get a copy of it because it's right on the bookshelf next to me. So it's this, you can see that.
Yeah.
See that. So it's that face that I think of. And I was kind of looking at how people become marginalized, what societal, environmental issues marginalize people. When does it come to the breaking point? So I might revisit that, but it was right at the time when the market was really heavily saturated with dystopian novels. So I might revisit it. It's really important because that's something I really feel strongly about, that these kind of issues need to be kept in our consciousness.
So the other question I was going to ask, because you sort of talked about going to do creative writing with the illustrators.
Yeah.
And I love asking if people would make a graphic novel of one of their books.
Oh, there's some amazing students I work with, and they do. Would I? Well, interestingly, the lake. I'm looking at. There's a BBC Writers' Room competition where you can submit a screenplay, and I'm looking at making that as a treatment. So just having a crack, because I think my work's quite visual. So I was thinking of, I might just try and adapt it as a screenplay and see if that gets any interest. Because I think the story, and also it's set in the Southwest, so it's kind of an area of interest that, you're seeing more and more dramas and crimes set in the Southwest. But I just thought it'd be quite cool. I think graphic novels. I used to work in the school's library service, and I used to choose books for schools, and I was really passionate about graphic novels because they engage young boys in reading who wouldn't normally engage with books. So I don't know. It's a really good question, Caroline. I don't know if it would suit it. The dystopian one would, but I'd certainly have a go, and I'd certainly get. I love working with artists and illustrators, so just adds a new string to your bow, I think.
I love to read graphic novels, and I'm like you. I agree that it encourages reluctant readers.
Yeah.
And it's a new way of kind of exploring fiction.
And the big thing is zines as well for kind of that generation. So there's short comics and short magazines. So I think they're great. And I think I work with a lot of students with dyslexia. So that's their natural medium for communication. I think it doesn't always have to be the written word. So it'd be quite interesting. You put another idea in my head, Caroline, for a project.
You're welcome. Andrew wants to know if you talk to people when doing your research.
I do.
And do you get any good ideas that way?
A lot of my ideas, and I'm sure like everyone, and if you're a crime reader, you probably are naturally think about plots and things. A lot of the times it's something I might read in the paper or I overhear or a story that's happening. But when I was researching, I had an idea years ago to write a kind of Agatha Christie style novel. And I thought, well, I'll have someone who's a forager and maybe they pick poison mushrooms. So I thought, how do you distill them into a powder form? And could I kill someone that way? So I emailed a professor of chemistry at a local university saying, could I do that? And he came back and said, oh, yeah. And he gave me the exact chemical formula and how much it would take to kill a man. So it's amazing what you can find out. I spoke to Dartmoor Search and Rescue Team for the current novel about how long a body could go missing in Dartmoor, forensic accountants, spinal surgeon. And, I think if you approach them, I normally include a link to the HarperCollins website so they can see that I'm a legitimate author. But absolutely, it's really interesting. You're learning about stuff that you wouldn't normally learn about. So absolutely.
Do you ever go down a really interesting research rabbit hole that you don't use?
I started with this book to look at forex trading, foreign exchange trading. So it's kind of online gambling where people buy foreign currency at a low rate and then try to sell it at a higher rate. And it gets people into a lot of problems. And I did get a little bit obsessed with it. But the danger with this is if you become too kind of fixated on the facts, you lose your reader. So I had to learn about what it was to touch on it, but I didn't want to go too much into it. And it's the same with a lot of cyber stuff. Since lockdown, readers are not really interested in cyber-based crime. They want connections and people for obvious reasons. So you can touch on it. At one point, I have someone hacking into a computer, but I didn't give all the details behind it because you don't really want to know that. You just want to know, just want to sense that it's believable. So lots of information that I probably won't use, but I kind of need to get that information that I can choose a tiny bit of it and write.
Andrew also wanted to know what you've written today. Or if you've written anything today before you came.
I haven't, Andrea, and I've been outed here. I'm actually starting to, I'm waiting for my note. It was quite exhausting. I was rewriting the book, My Husband's Secrets, I rewrote it in about a month. So I was really intense and working every morning and every weekend. So I'm having a little mental break. And then I'm going to, it's interesting when you're rewriting, it's a completely different process to writing fresh. So what I'm going to be doing with Vengeance Street, which I'm also redrafting, is doing a chapter by chapter breakdown, looking at what's working and what's not, and then starting afresh. So I did write something today because I ran a creative writing workshop. I work at Plymouth College of Art, and we did some free association stuff. So I wrote a piece that was sci-fi, which I don't normally write. So the kind of exercises I do is to get away from your internal critic. So I use prompts, music, images, and it worked because I don't normally write sci-fi. So that's maybe a good idea for those of you that get stuck with your writing, to do something completely out of your comfort zone, not to judge it, just to have a crack at it. So yeah, I did write a little bit.
Good
So I don't feel so ashamed. But you're right, Andrea. You need to be disciplined as a writer if you want to do it. And when I work with artists, they always talk about their practice. And I think as a writer, you have to have a practice and a routine as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sam wants to know if you've visited places to get a feel for them before or during writing.
I do. And in fact, a lot of the places, I was watching something on BBC Maestro with Jed Mercurio. He was talking about screenwriting and line of duty. And he was talking about primary experience. He said, so if you're writing something that you've experienced directly, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have been a detective, but you have to kind of understand what that character is going through. So I do find setting really important for me. I think it may be being Canadian that, our setting, our environment is it's so intense. I lived in the prairies. It was -40 in the winter. And when I left Toronto, it was 102 Fahrenheit. So you have these really extremes of weather. And so setting, even in suburban landscape, if I got lost in the woods, I could freeze to death quite easily. So you're really aware of your setting. So setting for me is important. For Vengeance Street, which I'm working on now, I took photographs. I went down to the locations where the bodies were found in Plymouth, and I took photographs because I really wanted to get a real strong sense of that environment, what it looked like, what it felt like. So absolutely. And I do I'm looking at setting a novel in Montreal, but I'm going to have to go there. I really don't want to do it from photographs or library stuff. So absolutely.
And it will have changed, won't it, since you lived there?
Oh yeah. So I haven't been back in 30 years. So, but I'm setting it in the 60s and 70s. So, but I think it's really important to have that really physical connection with what you're writing about. You can't always get it, so you can do research, but I like doing it. And the Plymouth is a really interesting city, and the Southwest is really interesting as well. You've got areas of absolute luxury alongside deprivation. That's quite interesting.
So Sam also wants to know what you've learned from writing book one that will help you going forward.
It's about being organized, Sam. So book one, I wrote over about 5, 6, 7 years. I was doing my MA. I was working full time. I was raising my children. My husband's in the Navy, so he was away a lot. There was no super pressure. But book two is a lot different. When you have a contract, I wrote that in 8 months. We had to implement some structure, some planning, chapter by chapter outlines, and just little tricks. So you don't really have the time to obsess over a paragraph. You have to, when something wasn't working, I would go on to the next bit. And I thought, I'll go back and fix that when I'm a bit tired. But while I'm writing, I just kept on pushing forward. And if I was I think I was stuck on a scene for about 4 days. And in the end, I just said, right, I'm skipping 2 chapters and I'm going to write that other scene. And then I'll go back to that later. So it becomes very process driven. It becomes very practical. But for me, that was good. I still made sure that I achieved what I wanted to, and I got my themes in. But you sort of become professional, and a lot of writers will write a book a year. So I just felt this is my time to learn how to put a process into place that I can do that. And I was late with my novel, by the way. I did go over my deadline, so I haven't quite got there. But lovely publishers who were very understanding. So
You took the Douglas Adams approach, like the
oh
fans
my
in
God.
British Pie.
Hopefully not as bad as Douglas Adams, but yeah, I really learned a lot more about the practicalities of writing, I think, than anything else. And learning and working with a publisher and understanding the business is a whole different kettle of fish. Not a bad one, but I do think you need to understand that a little bit. And I learned a lot about that.
So what's your planning process like? I feel like you're a proper planner.
Well, I am and I'm not. It's normally a kernel of an idea, and I I do a lot of mind mapping, but I do a lot of daydreaming. So there's that bit where I go for a walk or I'm in the bath or on the bus. We're talking about long bus journeys, and I start thinking, and it really does happen in my head. And I think that's where I learned is you get it down. I've started to do kind of a chapter by chapter breakdown, and I use a 3-act structure, which a lot of writers do. So your opening scenes, your rising action, then your tension, crisis, and then falling action. So 3 bits. And so I try to shape it that way. It keeps me on track, and I do a lot of little tricks to myself. I'll have a open a document that's overused words and phrases. So instead of stopping and going back, I can't tell you how many times I wrote, she made her way down the hall, or she made her way up the stairs. So I write that in a sheet of paper, and then I'll go back after and see how many times they're in my manuscript and then change them. So there's little tricks that you use that work for you. But I think, again, I guess the biggest thing I've learned is if you want to do this professionally, you have to be organized, um, which was a challenge because I'm not that organized.
Yeah, I was listening to you going, this is why I could never be an author. Not at all organised. And secondly, I use my long bus journeys to come up with crazy science experiments.
Well, that's just as valid and important, if not more. We need scientists as much as we need writers. I always make the joke. My husband's in the Navy. He's a diesel marine engineer, electrician, disaster trained. My son's paramedic. My daughter's radiographer. I'm a careers advisor. I think in the post-apocalypse, they're going to be in the compound. I'm not. I'm going to be on the outside, and you're going to be inside as a scientist. So um,
I'm just a science teacher. I don't.
it's still important.
For science.
I'm just looking. I'm just having a look at Sam's comment on. So for the current book, the book that's now with the editor, it was really interesting. I wrote it very dark, very quite aggressive, and it wasn't right. And my editor picked it up and said, first of all, the characters were nasty from the start. And she said, we need them to be more balanced. We need a happy marriage. So if and when things go bad, then we've got something to contrast and it's more tragic. And it was like a light went on in my head. So I changed all that. I developed, interesting that you said about characters, Caroline, because I made them more likable, more human, less one dimensional. And that led me to a completely different ending that is sad but beautiful, but based on characters rather than plot. So they kind of interact, but the characters are always the most important. So I absolutely changed the ending. Sam, we'll see how it goes. Who knows? Hopefully for the better.
Yeah, because there's a character in the lake that starts off, you think, quite nice and caring, and just progressively you like them less and less and less as
Yes.
they go, and you realize sort of as they go, sort of even when you were thinking they were nice, that they weren't actually being.
Yeah, and that's sort of part of that domestic noir experience, that this supposedly safe environment that should be safe is not. And part of that is kind of my own experiences growing up in a dysfunctional home, really. And I was finding out, I was speaking to film students about this, and I was talking about Jed Mercurio, and is it Andrew on there?
Mm-hmm.
If you go on BBC Maestro series, it's a subscription thing. It's like a master classes, so it's a bit pricey. But Jed Mercurio does kind of an online class about screenwriting. But we were talking about primary experience, and I said, having grown up in a quite violent home, I said, I understand the threat. I understand it, implied threat, perceived threat, because I lived it. So that's why I write it. Because for me, I guess it's a continuing exploration of why that happened, how that happened, why people behave that way in a healthy way. It's something I can deal with healthily. So I think in terms of what you're referring to, that underlying threat, it increases the stake, increases the tension, and it kind of gives a believable motivation for why characters do something that seems out of character, or maybe isn't likable, but you kind of feel for them. I wanted the reader to go, well, that's not a great thing to do, but yeah, I'm glad you did it. That sort of feeling. And it's multi-layered. And for me, you have to help the reader. Well, create a situation where the reader can believe that.
But I think for me, that's the talent in the writing of that, is you're taking something that's quite needs those characters and that layer of complexity, and you've got to build it so that people don't notice
Yeah.
that, and that takes it. It feels very simple when you're reading it.
Yeah.
And it feels like it develops really naturally, but that's because you've put a lot of work in to make
Well,
that work, and you've done it really well because
thank
it's
you.
slow.
It is a lot of work. So you'll go and you'll write something, and then in the book I've just finished, I'll go back 6 chapters and go, have I said that? So a good example is, it's not really a spoiler. Early on, very early, I just gave a general description of a character's life, that her father worked in IT, and then he left it. And then later in the book, she needs someone, and she's estranged from her father. But later on in the book, she needs someone to hack into a computer. So she has to go and seek out her father. So it's those, you set up these little red flags early on, and you connect the dots later. And I love doing that. It's a bit like a kind of jigsaw puzzle or a crossword puzzle. You're putting the clues, and then you tie everything up. And for me, as a writer, it's very satisfying. I hope it's satisfying for the readers as well.
It is very. very
Good.
satisfying. When you read a book and you're just taken along like that, I think it's good to sort of know
And
that you're in those good hands, like you're going to go
yeah,
on that journey with the characters.
and that was very intentional on my part. I wanted to keep every chapter, I wanted to have a little bit of a cliffhanger. But in the second book, I tried too hard. And my editor said, God, there's too much going on here. Too much happening. So I had to kind of tone it back. And the second book is like the second album, it's really difficult because you've got expectations of a book you've already written. You want to do something different, but you want to make sure you're using a formula that's successful. So I found that a bit of a struggle, but I just think it's a continuing learning thing. You're constantly learning and growing, trying things. And I guess I'm at the stage in my life where I'm not so worried about failure. Uh, I try and think of it as a learning experience and see how we go. So yeah,
There's some excellent moments as well where you go in the books to these very exclusive kind of schools
yes.
that are just like had some of my favorite parts in.
And I've not really, it's not really a North American thing for children to go to boarding schools unless they're very, very exclusive. So I've found that something again, uh, you set up the scenario to serve your plot in many ways. You create the characters to serve your plot. The characters contribute to the plot. Uh, but so that's a really good point, Caroline. I can't remember. I think I needed the situation to happen away from his mum. And so I needed the public school or private school, as we would say. It's sort of based on ones around the Southwest that I explored.
I suppose
So,
over here they're exclusive as well. Like you don't just go to boarding school.
no,
Unless,
considering
I mean, sometimes military children do,
they
don't they?
do, they can do. And I think they're funded because if the parents are out of the country and things like that. But again, I guess it goes back to a real strong theme of isolation, that the mother's isolated, the son was isolated from his mother. She becomes increasingly isolated as she's trying to find out what really happened. And she isolates herself as well. And I think I'm not sure how much I used landscape. I'm really interested in the moors and in the landscape around here because it's quite diverse. So I did talk, like kind of use water imagery and things like that. But God, it's really interesting to have this conversation because I'm really thinking a lot deeper about what I did and thinking, oh, maybe it was just one big accident. Maybe I'm not that skilled.
I think malls are a really excellent setting for a crime novel. I live in Yorkshire, so we have moors all
Yeah.
around us as well, and they're quite what's the word? Sarah Ward was using this when I interviewed her recently. They're quite kind of liminal spaces, aren't they? They're sort of so desolate,
Yes.
and you really do have to know what you're doing
Very
when you're
true.
out on them. They're really dangerous and
Yeah,
barren places, and I think they're excellent for
they are.
literature.
Primal and really primal spaces as well. I think about the granite. If you go in the moors and Dartmoor, there's granite poking out of the ground everywhere, really quite treacherous. So I've used a bit of that in the next book as well. And that, again, the threat that's all around you, the human threat and the physical threat of the environment, which is interesting.
Sam wants to know if there's anywhere you'd like to live while you set a book there.
Sorry, is there anywhere I'd
Like to live while you set a book there.
trying to think of what I would like to go. So one of the stories that I'm thinking about, which I was going to set in Montreal, but I could set in the moors and Cornwall, but it wouldn't be seaside. It would be somewhere in central Cornwall that isn't glamorous, that has poverty and deprivation, that is a real contrast to the image of what we perceive as the sunny Cornwall and how people live in that environment. So I worked with homeless people for a number of years, and I really understand some of the challenges that they've had to experience, and I'd really like to explore that. So maybe somewhere like I'd love to go. I really haven't had that much experience of visiting the north of England. I almost feel that I would have to be in a place to really write about it. So I would think Cornwall. I would like to get back to Montreal. One of the reasons that Montreal interests me is there's still the French-English conflict. So it's a really great place to set a novel because you have an already ingrained conflict. Just like if you were setting a novel in Northern Ireland, you already have the conflict there. So yeah, I guess Cornwall, I wouldn't mind. I think we've got plenty of crime novels set in Yorkshire, but I can't think of where else. Maybe.
Well, you've travelled quite a bit, having a husband in the Navy.
Yeah. So I lived well, I've been mostly in Plymouth, but I grew up as in Montreal, lived in the prairies in Toronto, and then down here. And my husband's been all over the world. He's been in really interesting places. But I like exploring the danger in the familiar. So what's unseen interestingly, my tutor and my MA talked about my work, talking about how all the boundaries blur. So you've got your domestic boundary, you've got your professional boundaries, you've got your psychological boundaries, and I like how the rules become really blurred, and that's where bad things happen, I think. So I don't really know. Good question. I love the Fens. We've got friends that live in Cambridge, so I really and a writer friend of mine, Judy Dakin, writes stuff set in the Fens in Norfolk. So that's another beautifully bleak area. So I think something that has strong physical setting where I'd explore next. You're asking good questions.
I really like that kind of bleak kind of countryside. That's, the moors.
A contrast, Iceland, yeah. A contrast to the tourist. So when I had to do a presentation for my MA on setting, and I was looking at Plymouth, and I had like tourist photographs. We have Pirate Weekend in August, and then I did research on Public Health England, and Plymouth has some of the highest teenage pregnancies, literacy issues, hospitalizations for drug and alcohol overuse. And then, so I had these two slides, and I was going back and forth with the Pirate Weekend and the kind of situation. And that's what makes conflict, this really kind of contrasting environment. And what you see on the surface is not necessarily what's happening underneath. So again, I really like that. And then bringing in an environment like, well, if you go on the moors, you can be walking and the mist drops. You're really in danger. You really can be in a dangerous place. And if you ever come to Devon, there's a beautiful drive from Plymouth to Princetown where Dartmoor Prison is. And Dartmoor Prison is this Napoleon. It was originally built in the Napoleonic era, and it sits kind of at the top. It's the highest, it's really high above sea level. You've got this beautiful, bleak, long, straight road, and then you see this granite prison. So it's really dramatic. So I guess I like setting as a character for me is important.
Me too. I've only ever been to Dartmouth in Devon.
It's not beautiful, but you have to come down. I've been into Dartmoor a few times when I was working with a charity, and I would go and do outreach days. So when prisoners are being prepared to leave, we'd go and offer advice. And I was doing this one event, and I had the person I was with left early, and I had the screens that you pull up, those pull-up screens. I had tablecloth and all my stuff, and I was following everyone down the hall, and I almost got locked inside Dartmoor prison. I was going, no, wait, don't lock me in. But it's really interesting environment.
Quite
I'm a
intimidating though, isn't it? Like when you go and visit a prison, I've done it for like sort of release visits for students and things, and it's quite
it's daunting, isn't it?
mm,
It um, Dartmoor is a category C, so it's low level, but I've been in category A prisons, and they're really, I can remember seeing prisoners and thinking, I've never seen anyone that pale in my life. And they call it prison tan because they're in their cells 23 hours a day. And it is can be, what was more frightening for me was going into a mental health unit um, because of just the sense of suffering that these people were experiencing. I found it really, my heart just went out to them that these people are in that place. Yeah. That's what I want to write about. Even if it's difficult, I'm interested in people and how people cope and why they behave the way they do. And I hope I'd never exploit people. I would never do that, but I do want to explore those themes.
yeah.
I'm just looking at someone who's talked about, I would love to have my work adapted for screen. I would love it. Uh, it's very visual. I did study film at uni, and I think visually, so I would really love it. When you read a book, there are a lot of books come out. It doesn't necessarily become a bestseller. I mean, I'm really pleased with the reviews I've had, but it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to pick it up. So, as I said, I'm looking at adapting it for BBC Writers' Room competition, just to sort of teach myself screenwriting. But I would love my work to be on television. I think it's suited for that medium, but we'll see.
So I'm going to ask you some of our group's favourite questions
Okay.
because it's always fun to ask them.
Okay.
Have you ever acted out a scene?
I read them aloud. I have. I act them out in my head, so I very much am in the character's head, and I imagine myself as a character and what they would do. Definitely. So yes, definitely act them out. I definitely imagine how I would respond. I'm a big daydreamer in my head, so absolutely. And I also, this is not so much about acting out, but a trick I discovered when I'm editing is I use the readback facility on Word. So if you go into, I think it's into review, you can actually have a kind of computerized voice read back your text so you can hear poor grammar. And but the best bit is if a character, so sometimes it's not terrible language, but a character might say, "Oh, for Christ's sake." And when it read backs, it goes, "For Christ's sake." And so it's very, so you sometimes get an interesting, but I absolutely do act out the scenes and live them in my head. Absolutely.
Do you ever, if you're quite visual, have pictures of what you think the characters look like?
I don't. And for for the lake and for all my books, I don't really describe. I have to make myself describe the characters. Partly why I didn't want to do that. Interestingly, talking about TV stuff, for Vengeance Street particularly, I didn't want to define the characters' looks because I wanted, if it was made for television, I would want it to be played by a woman of any ethnicity. So I didn't want to say she was blonde or whatever, but that doesn't really matter when it comes uh, to kind of a TV production. I don't really have a picture, but I do actually I do copy and paste pictures of locations more than people. So we have pictures of river, of the moors, of a vehicle, some of the some of the research. So the the book My Husband's Secrets is the characters and her husband do a barn conversion. So I researched staircases, the most boring Google search in the world, and bifold doors. So it's not always exciting. I honestly researched wooden staircases. But I had to know what they were like to describe her. She's been injured in a car crash. She's struggling up the staircase. I wanted to describe it viscerally. what it's like trying to make your way up a wooden staircase when you've got spinal injuries. So that's why I did it, so it can be real.
We once moved house when I was little to a house because my mum liked the staircase.
I like your mum. But it's funny the things that hook you and grab you, isn't it? And that's, I guess, my friend says about. She always says my writing is like fine, like dots. It's minutiae. And some of my favorite, one of my favorite writers is Anne Tyler, who, and if you read her stuff, she really touches on the throwaway moments in life, but she really makes them magical. So I like to do that in my writing and look at all those tiny things that impact on how people are.
And I think that stands out. I think those little details all through the lake are what makes it such a nice reading experience.
Yeah, thank you.
I was like, when I sort of believe that the author knows more about what's happening in the book than I do, or more than even in the book.
Yeah.
Like a really well-built world.
I spent a lot of time and thought in that. I guess I worry a little bit in the next book that I haven't had the time to develop that, but I will still get notes back from my editor, and then I'm going to look at adding more layers, because that's really something, the unspoken, particularly in human contact and in relationships, is so powerful. When you see a couple and you think, oh, they just had a row, you can just tell by their body language or what's going on, and you may not be able to pinpoint it, but something's gone on. That's the kind of stuff that it really interests me as well.
Well, a lot of our communication as people is non.
Absolutely. Yeah. And particularly the messages you can get across, the unspoken. And that's where, in a way, you can misinterpret. So in this next book, a lot happens through misinterpretation and poor communication, which ends in a real tragedy, which is so sad, but I wanted to do it, so I did it. I thought, I've got to go down this route. I've got to do something that's heartbreaking, but I'm going to go for it.
Have you, I've got another question here. Have you spoken to any experts of various professions to help with your research?
Well, interestingly, I'm trying to think about the lake. I did a lot of research. So I did speak to people who had lived in communities like Plymouth Brethren. I did a lot of research on that. In the book that I've just sent to my editor, I spoke to a forensic accountant. So this is someone who deals with major fraud and how that happens. That was quite interesting. You wouldn't think, oh, accountancy, but this person deals with major crime. That was quite interesting. I used to volunteer as an independent custody visitor. So I used to go into custody suites and chat to people, make sure their human rights were being observed. So that gives you a sense of what a custody suite is like, how it is to be checked into a custody suite. And before I did that, I actually went to the police station. I knew a policeman, and I got them to talk me through what happens when someone's processed for a DUI. And so they took me up to the suite where you have your breathalyzed and fingerprinted, so I could really write about it authentically. So those were quite interesting. Again, the Dartmoor Search and Rescue I spoke to, and a spinal expert, physiotherapist. So absolutely really important. And it's interesting because I learned something new as well. And I did have a police detective who told me he's a family member, so he could give me some insight into how the police, family liaison officer mostly.
That's interesting. Are you ever tempted with your experience of sort of having family that are scientists or family in the Navy to sort of have a bit of a military edge to one of your books?
Some of the things I've heard, but I don't know. When I was a ICV, Independent Custody Visitor, I did sign the Official Secrets Act, So I couldn't really write, and I wouldn't write about people in custody. It wouldn't be appropriate. And the people there they weren't Hannibal Lecters or exciting dynamic. They're tragic stories. So I would never write that. But yeah, well, I was thinking of Vigil, recently. I haven't really, but I certainly have experts if I need to. And I did ask, I remember once when I was writing The Lake, and there's a scene where the main character is threatened by a family member. And I said to my son, I said, can you just pin me up against the wall and put your hand around my neck so I know what it feels like? And he went, no! But I said, I need to describe what it feels like for this woman to be pinned up against the wall. And he wouldn't do it, bless him. But that's how you make it real. So that I can be in that head of that person and see what the pressure feels like. How I remember doing not a first aid course, but a safety course, women's safety course, and thinking, right, if this guy it was in the Navy through service wives, and I thought, oh, I'll be able to get myself out. And then we were pinned down. It was a Royal Marine, and there's no way I would have got out of there. And so those are the kind of things I remember. I thought if I ever had to write about a situation, I remember what it feels like to be that helpless. So I guess that's one of the ways I like to make things authentic and real.
Memorable moments as an author. That's one of our favourite questions. What are your memorable moments as an author?
I think winning the big issue competition. So this book has been floating around for 8 or 10 years. I wrote it, left it, rewrote it, and on the Monday, I had my 12th rejection from an agent for the book. And then the following Friday, I had the email from HarperCollins saying, "You've won this competition and you've got a 2-book deal." And I was literally going to put this book on the shelf. And I thought, and I was also thinking, do I want to stop doing this? And I thought, no, I love writing. I'm going to keep on writing. I'm not going to worry so much about getting published. I'm just going to do it because I love it. And then it changed in the space of 4 days. So for any of you writers out there, if you believe in that story you're writing, don't give up. Particularly if you really feel strongly about it, keep on working, exploring other ways to get your work out there, but don't give up. I am the perfect example of that. And I'm still learning. I'm still working hard. It wasn't easy. I don't expect it to be easy, but it enriches my life. It makes me happy. And I get to meet nice people like you.
I'm really glad you got your book out there as well, because I got a really lovely read last week. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Really appreciate it. It's nice. Being writers can be so isolating. You're on your own, and you always so self-critical. So to have positive feedback means a lot.
Someone's just started singing in the house next to me. I don't know if you can hear that on the thing. It's just really disconcerting.
Well, we've got trampolines on either side. So in the summer when it's hot in the window, I mean, the kids are lovely, both families, so I can't be cross. But sometimes all you hear is boing, boing, ah! So you just get on with it, don't you?
Someone serenading. That's
lovely.
Sama said thank you for such a wonderful hour, such detailed answers.
Oh, thank you.
We've got a minute left. Do you want to give us a recap of you and show off your book again so people can go over it?
So I am a fiction writer, short story writer. I love teaching as well. I'm interested in exploring themes based around families, not just families, but why good people are driven to do bad things. Unreliable narrators, unlikable characters, but unlikable characters that you buy into and you feel for. And the book is called The Lake. I've got to get that right. It's out now. You can order it on Amazon or on Kindle. And it was going to be in the shops, but this happened around the lockdown, and what was going on is there were so many books being bought in supermarkets that they went for kind of established writers. So I'm hoping the next one gets out there in the shops, but I'll just keep on plugging away. And thank you for, your time and for listening. It's really, really wonderful.
Thanks for joining us. It's been a delight talking to you.
And congratulations on a great Facebook group. It's amazing. Such good spirited people and kind people and funny. Some of your dad's jokes, though, boy.
You can't, yeah, they're terrible.
But it's a really generous, kind group. There's no nastiness. It's just good fun and genuine book lovers. So I'm really pleased to be a part of the group and to be here tonight. So thank you.
Well, thanks. See you.
Yeah. And hopefully I'll let you